So honored guests and valued friends, it is such a delight and an honor to welcome you to this event, the launch event for the Center for Reimagining Leadership. My name is Jody Greene, and I am the Associate Campus Provost for Academic Success and a member of the steering committee of the Center for Reimagining Leadership. So to begin the evening, I would like to introduce our musicians. Ashwin Batish is a composer, sitar and tabla player, teacher of music, and recording artist. Over the past 45 years, he has taught at San Jose State University, Mills College, UC Santa Cruz, and Cabrillo College, and at his Santa Cruz-based private school, the Batish Institute of Indian Music and Fine Arts. He is the son of Bollywood music director, composer, author, and vocalist Pandit S.D. Batish, who was invited to teach Indian music at UC Santa Cruz's Merrill College at the university's instigation in the early 1960s. Ashwin has also directed and produced numerous self-help tutor videos to teach Indian musical instruments such as tabla, sitar, dilruba, tholak, tanpura, vichurtravina, and harmonium. He is also the editor of an online magazine called Raga.net, where he posts regular lessons on sitar, tabla, singing, harmonium, and more, along with articles pertaining to Indian music theory and practice. Keshav Batish is a multi-instrumentalist music maker whose work expresses networks of sonic kinship through dialogue across and parallel to cultures. Keshav is a hereditary practitioner of South Asian musics. He is trained in instrumental and vocal styles by his father, Pandit Ashwin Batish, and his aunt, Pandita Meena Batish. Keshav also holds intervals of study with creative music makers, such as Hafez Modirzadeh and Charles Tolliver. Keshav currently pursues a doctorate in music composition at the University of California, Santa Cruz, under the guidance of Professors Carlton E. Hester, James Gordon Williams, Amy C. Beale, and Dard Newman. So please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Thank you so much. I don't know if this thing is on, but okay, no problem. All right, folks. Am I? Okay. It doesn't have to be on. I can yell. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be a part of this gala event. And thank you for the wonderful introduction. Beautiful to see such a gathering. As you see, I've been very busy. Life has shown me a great pathway, and thanks to my dad and thanks to the university, we are all children of the university. My children are now going over here, and so it's a really beautiful experience to be a part of this thing. I'm glad I can share some music with you. The instrument is called the sitar. As soon as I get a little juiced up here, literally.
ये आपको ये बेवरेज चाहिए?
हाँ?
पानी?
No. I just need some. Okay, good.
So this evening, we are graced by the presence of Chairman Valentin Lopez to give the land acknowledgement. Valentin Lopez has served as chair of the Amamutsan Tribal Band since 2003 and the president of the Amamutsan Land Trust since its inception. Valentin is a Native American advisor to the University of California Office of the President on issues related to repatriation. He is also a Native American advisor to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, and the Phoebe Hearst Museum of Anthropology. He is actively involved in efforts to restore tribal indigenous knowledge and ensure tribal history is accurately told.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I want to give special recognition and acknowledgement to Enrico and Sakina for your work this evening. Thank you very much. For the land acknowledgement, I don't have a land acknowledgement that I read. I want to just take a couple minutes and just tell you about the people upon whose land we're on this evening. The lands that we're on this evening belong to the Uipi tribe. The Uipi tribe were one of 7 Awaswas-speaking tribes. They occupied the lands from Aptos, just south of here, up to approximately the lighthouse, the Pigeon Point Lighthouse, and to the ridge line of the Santa Cruz Mountains. Unfortunately, today there are no known survivors of any of the 7 Awaswas-speaking tribes. And that's just sad. That is just sad. And so I want us to think for a moment of the Awaswas and to recognize them, that they were mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters, grandmothers and grandfathers, uncles and aunts, that they had incredibly strong relationships with each other and strong relationships with the tribes that were their neighboring tribes. They were human beings. When people think of the indigenous peoples that were here, oftentimes that point is never remembered or just forgotten. They were human beings. They were scientists. They were doctors. They were teachers. They had their businesses. They had a very strong trade routes throughout the Santa Cruz Mountains. They had their spiritual leaders, and they were very prayerful. We cannot forget who they are. We have to honor them, and we have to remember them. So as this effort for leadership goes forward, I ask you to keep that in mind, to remember who the Awaswas were and are, and to work to ensure they are remembered and never forgotten. I also want to talk for a moment about the importance of looking at relationships. When we talk about leadership, we want to look at relationships. And they have to be healthy relationships. And to have healthy relationships, it takes 2 or more healthy people, organizations, entities, etc., to have a healthy organization. And organizations that are tied to the destruction of indigenous people, that has to be looked at and understood. And they have to work to heal from that past, from that history. And you heal by telling the truth. You heal by listening to others and letting them tell the truth. And you build trust. And all these qualities that are on these tables, that's what it takes to develop healthiness. And we hope and believe and know that the center that's being developed will follow that path.
I just want to take a little moment of silence after that so we can all absorb that. Thank you, Chairman Lopez. So it is my pleasure to introduce our Chancellor, Cindy Larive.
Thank you, Jody, and thank you, Chairman Lopez, for your wise words and starting us off in a reflective tone. I also believe that this center will do much in the vein of your comments. I'm so pleased to be here tonight, and I'm extremely proud of the work that's being done through the center, connecting talented and visionary people across all the career stages of their journey. Undergraduate students, graduate students, postdocs, and early career faculty. The center supports them as they move toward and into their chosen fields. There are institutional barriers that students and faculty of color and women face on their paths to success and ultimately to leadership in the university and beyond. And I laud the center's efforts to remove these barriers. Excellence in science is not possible without equitable participation, and our leadership must reflect our community. So it's a great pleasure for me to acknowledge the work of 3 people who have been vital to the center's creation and launch. Our Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor, Lori Pletzer, who unfortunately can't be with us tonight, has been central to this effort, a booster of the center since it was first imagined. Sakina Jinnah, the center's Associate Director, is a leader in the field of environmental justice, and she has been visionary in her efforts to bring climate justice to the forefront of the center's concerns. So thank you for that, Sakina. And finally, Enrico Ramirez Ruiz, the center's director. Enrico is first and foremost an exceptional scientist. He is a leading authority on some of the most dramatic events in the universe. Collisions, mergers, and disruptions of stars. It's really quite exciting. And in addition to his scientific research and teaching, Enrico has been a research advisor for more than 200 bachelor's and master's students from underrepresented backgrounds. I think we can applaud for that. Between Enrico's mentoring and the Lamont program, Enrico has reached more than half of all students from minoritized groups who've received a PhD in astronomy in the past 5 years. Half. That's an astounding statistic. And as Chairman Lopez says, those are all people. And we should think about that. Enrico was deservedly honored at the White House last year by President Joe Biden with the Presidential Award for Excellence in Science, Mathematics, and Engineering Mentoring. And I'm so grateful for the hard work of many who have helped to stand this center up. I know that together we will make a difference.
Thank you, Cindy. And another reminder that you are allowed to eat. You are encouraged to eat, to nourish yourself, to feed yourself, etc. Okay. So now, I'm going to say a few words. Thank you all again for being here tonight to celebrate the launch of the Center for Reimagining Leadership. Chancellor Larive has given you a sense of the broad mission and ambitions of the center and of its extraordinary leadership team. I want briefly to talk about where the center came from, its origin story, which I think will help you understand what we are really here to celebrate tonight. And then I want to say a few words about my brother, Enrico, because as many of you know, I always get the easy assignments at UC Santa Cruz. So the center arose from a question, a research question to be exact. What would it take institutionally and structurally to transform the path to leadership so that we could solve the biggest challenges facing us within the university in our original conversations, but now, of course, far beyond it, in science, in climate justice, and on our planet as a whole. How could we, as Enrico puts it, gather the excellence that is distributed everywhere throughout the population and ensure that we remove the barriers that stop groups historically underrepresented in leadership roles, particularly BIPOC scholars and activists, but also women, non-binary, and queer people, from moving into the place from which, as our campus might say, they can lead the change? To put this another way, what if leaders in research, policy, education, and other institutions, as well as community leaders, looked more like the people to whom those leaders are accountable, the people they say they serve? The project started with a grant we received from the University of California Office of the President, funding research by Dr. Rebecca Covarrubias, who's with us tonight, on how faculty members of color on our own campus thought about the pathway to academic leadership. In the course of her interviews, it became clear that many of these faculty members were not drawn to taking up leadership positions in the long term for at least two reasons. First, they did not see models of leadership for genuine transformation, only for running the university we already have, with its existing inequities and exclusions. I hope and believe that 5 years later, that sense of an unchangeable and stuck institution has begun to shift, maybe a little. But it was a powerful finding that has guided the work of the center ever since. The second reason these colleagues didn't see a path to leadership was because they reported that throughout their careers here and elsewhere in academia, they had felt unable to thrive in an institution that systematically demands more of BIPOC faculty than it does of their white colleagues, that expects these faculties to carry the weight of the day-to-day work of equity, diversity, and racial justice, often in isolation, while also meeting all the same measures of productivity their non-BIPOC colleagues meet. They reminded us too, particularly but not only in science, that these conventional measures of productivity and excellence, from grant selection to publications to teaching evaluations, systematically exclude, obstruct, and devalue the work of faculty of color, and in many cases of women as well. As we began to discuss how to change the landscape around leadership development, this research showed us with a kind of flash of clarity that to produce the leaders of the future, we would have to back up and back up and back up, providing support and mentoring at every stage of the academic pipeline, or pathway as I prefer. We would need early career support in the areas of research and teaching to offset the structural barriers early career faculty of color face, including isolation, devaluation, and marginalization, in order to ensure not only that we retain these faculty, but that they have the opportunity not to be overburdened and overworked, but to have access instead to resources and professional development, but also to community and care. To ensure a continued pool of outstanding early career faculty, we would need robust support for graduate students and postdocs to ensure that enough of our postgraduate talent ever makes it to the faculty in the first place. And we would in turn need support for undergraduate research and mentorship, such as that Enrico has developed in the LAMAT program, to create a guided pathway for students from historically underrepresented and excluded groups to make it to doctoral programs in science and beyond. So this is how the center, in the hands of a steering committee of outstanding scholar, activist, practitioner, educators, has repeatedly and joyfully expanded, deepened, and clarified our vision of what reimagining leadership for science and climate justice really takes. And we have done so through the vision and example of Enrico Ramirez Ruiz. Chancellor Larive has said a little bit about Enrico's achievements as a scientist, educator, and mentor, and his outsized transformational effect on the field of astronomy and astrophysics. It falls to me then to say a little bit about him as a leader, as a comrade, and as a human being. With a lot of deep breaths. Enrico has committed his life to supporting others to be successful, never taking credit for those successes, To give this much of your time and life force to supporting others, to supporting their flourishing and thriving in that expanded notion of success is very, very rare in the academy. To commit yourself to lifting up and personally mentoring so many emerging scientists at every level of the profession, undergraduate, graduate student, postdoc, early career, mid-career, this is an astonishing effort and an enormous gift. I remember Enrico once explaining to me that when he co-authors papers with a new graduate student, he actually gets into a Google Doc in real time and spends hours writing with them. Somehow this image for me exemplifies his capacity to simultaneously lead and partner, to be for and to be with, quite beautifully. Enrico has been tireless in his advocacy for and work on behalf of transforming the university to live up to its stated values of promoting equity, excellence, and social and racial justice. But his aspirations and those of the center, particularly through his work alongside Associate Director Sakina Jinnah, have developed far beyond transforming the university to transforming the planet as a whole and the communities, human and non-human, with whom we share this earth. Enrico and Sakina have built the center on a collaborative model of leadership with a steering committee that learns and visions together while responsibly leveraging the range, and it is a very wide range of experience, expertise, resources, and cultural wealth that we collectively bring to the table. It is a true model of co-creation, of what can be accomplished when we show up to our work, to this work, here in the university, here in this broken world, as whole human beings, capable of great things and supported in our vulnerabilities, in the places where we still have much to learn. Asked to summarize Enrico's leadership capacities, the qualities that have allowed him to plant the seed of this center, his very own granulito, as one of Tuesday's speakers put it, I would simply say this. Here is a leader fueled by his passion for excellence and justice, but also, importantly, perhaps most importantly, powered by love. I give you Enrico Ramirez Ruiz.
You got me. I'll do some deep breaths. I'll start with my origin story a little bit. I rewrote these remarks last night at 10 p.m. So, growing up, I never really understood nature. It was something I didn't have access to. I grew up in Mexico City. I was afraid of it. Part of this was about imagining being attacked by coyotes and snakes. Those who know me know that I'm terrified of snakes. But there was also a sense of nature as something that was unsafe on a deeper level, that fear of being alone or attacked. Interestingly, it is similar to how I feel in most academic spaces in this country. One night in Veracruz, while in my teens, sleeping outside in a forest, I got one of the most restful, peaceful sleeps of my life. I realized my body could trust my surroundings enough to fall asleep profoundly. You know, there's a certain kind of clarity waking up after sleep like that, breathing the fresh air and feeling like the space you are is your space. The more I was in nature, the more I was able to connect with and discover my own wisdom. That sense of wisdom of and in all things has transformed how I understand organizing, having only a few people leading and organizing space and holding all the answers and solutions no longer feels conducive or helpful. Not when there's so much more in a room to share. I'm no longer willing to sacrifice an entire section of an ecosystem. We all share in the creation of knowledge. We trust each person to hear and listen and create that healthy ecosystem together. Nurtured and inspired by nature, I structured my remarks in 3 parts. Part 1, hearing the language of trees. listening to and amplifying the voices of marginalized scholars. Yes, I blame you for this. When I come beneath the redwoods into that particular multicolor light, time slows, and I fall under their spell. It is the spaciousness of their vaulted ceilings, I ask. Perhaps it's the quivering energy of the electrical micro-discharges emanating from the needles. I'm a scientist. Maybe we're humbled simply by their size. There's something there we sense, but we cannot name. A feeling similar to sitting quietly in the presence of our abuelos. So it is with redwoods. You want to slip into their circle and just listen. The Popol Vuh speaks of a past in which all beings spoke the same language and life lessons stream among species. But we have forgotten or been made to forget. How to listen so that we all hear is just simply empty sounds. The soft whistle of needles in the wind in the redwoods is really at a clear acoustic signature of their presence. But this well-known whispering is just sound. It's not their voices. What if you were a great teacher, a holder of knowledge and a vessel of wisdom, but had no audible voice to which to speak? What if your listeners presumes you to be mute, save for the passive whispering of your needles? How would you bring your truth into the world? Wouldn't you want to dance your story in branch and root? When I was thinking about describing the center, I thought, a core tenet that drives the Center for Reimagining Leadership is our concerted efforts to listen and amplify the voices of marginalized and underrepresented scholars, those redwoods in the forest, thus enable them to dance their stories in branch and root. I'm deeply grateful to find myself today immersed in this forest of brilliant scholars. I have learned so much from all of you, and it is incredibly important for me to share this space with you. Part 2, cultivating trust. Lessons from the mycelium mushrooms. I have learned emergent strategy in conversations with a few magical individuals who inspire me by talking about how they practice the teachings of Adrienne Mary Brown. Mycelium mushrooms have one of the greatest teachers of trust for emergent strategies. The word mycelium means more than one. The mycelium organism is a dynamic root system of mushrooms that utilize trust as a mechanism to build and sustain a vast reciprocal on-the-ground network that connects the roots of the trees and skillfully shares nutrients and resources to support the health of the entire ecosystem, with which it moves from within. The mycelium network cannot exist without trust. The mycelium communication highway recognizes and believes in the collective ability to channel and receive nutrients where needed, protect against parasites, and expand roots into the necessary sites of growth. The network process also fosters intergenerational relationships that welcome the myriad of ancient wisdom and connections that reside in older trees to benefit younger trees. These mushrooms affirm a commitment to building relationships of trust that encourage all life to bloom, one that we aspire to embody more and more in an organizing practice at the center. A catalyst to grow beyond ourselves, to attempt to create brave and healthy spaces to yield a wider focus, often unseen with a singular lens. I'm deeply grateful to every member of the center who illuminates the potential to generate meaningful communication, yield collaboration grounded in substance, bolster collective commitment, and acknowledge competence and worth. A community that takes the time to ensure that our practices are aligned with our values. Thank you for co-creating a future that is desired but unfinished. I also want to thank the opportunity to openly recognize the bravery required to support the co-creation of such spaces. The call for campus leaders at all levels is that they must now be brave enough to ask themselves, whether their practices and their investments are making a difference to the lived experience of those most impacted. The center would not exist without the inceptive support of Jody Greene, Paul Koch, John McMillan, and the boldness of Lori Klesner. Thank you for sustaining and empowering leaders from underrepresented groups by acknowledging and investing in our leadership. Part 3, the light, the burden of invisible labor in academia. Trees need to grow, and trees need sunlight to grow. Light and heat makes it possible for life to exist on Earth. Light is essential to agriculture, cultivating land, and producing crops. But light is often omitted from the conversation. The light and heat of our universities are the individuals actually getting campuses up and running every day. The staff, including many educators, advisors, clerical staff, food service workers, cleaning staff, graduate workers, and many others. Faculty and staff occupy two very different worlds. Although we work for the same employer, faculty by definition enjoy more job security and power to shape how the university runs, while campus staff continue to be far more vulnerable and many times invisible. University employees, myself included, have witnessed staff treated as no more than faceless service providers. Despite being integral to our institution, staff may find their expertise questioned or ignored, and they're routinely left out from the decision-making process. The privilege we give faculty over staff appears to be key to academic culture, and if we're willing to devaluate someone based on their work, you're willing to devaluate them based on other identity markers. In addition, intersectionality teaches us that all the aspects that constitute our identity combine to create different and frequently compounding experience of privilege and discrimination. If academic institutions want their diversity efforts to really truly be grounded in anti-discriminatory practices, we must consider workforce inequities as part of the problem. Our campus, including our center, must work to eradicate these institutional hierarchies that undermine our credibility and contribute to the larger social issues of ignoring labor and mistreating unseen workers. Our university would not and cannot exist without these individuals. I want to take a pause and acknowledge the care, love, and dedication that so many staff members brought into co-creating this event. The light, heat, and warmth that went into every single aspect of tonight's celebration. We want to acknowledge that we see your effort and are so deeply thankful. Thank you. Chance of revolution. Marcia, I'm coming. We are gathered here today to reflect on reimagining leadership for climate science and justice. And it's really my sincere pleasure and honor to introduce you to my dear friend, Sakina Jinnah, our insightful guide for this evening. Sakina, as he was said, is a professor of environmental studies and the associate director of the center. Her research focuses on global environmental governance in the areas of climate change, climate engineering, and the nexus between international trade and environmental politics. There's many things I could say about Sakina. She's an inspirational teacher and a brilliant scholar. She has the ability to be grounded and dream widely. Rooted like a tree, she moves forward boldly. She has really the unique capacity to both hold great vision and do the work to manifest. That is incredibly rare. This makes her a truly remarkable leader who I greatly admire. I give you Sakina.
Welcome, everyone. As we transition into the panel portion of the evening. It's my delight, pleasure, honor to introduce the panelists. I feel almost, I'm taken to share the stage with you all. You all are amazing scholars. And I will start with Dr. Katja Risling-Baldi, who's an associate professor of Native American Studies at California Polytechnic State University, Humboldt. Her research focuses on indigenous feminisms, California Indians, environmental justice, and decolonization. She received her PhD in Native American Studies with a designated emphasis in feminist theory and research from UC Davis, and her MFA in creative writing and literary research from San Diego State University. Dr. Risling-Baldi is Hupa Yurok and Karuk, and an enrolled member of the Hupa Valley Tribe in Northern California. Welcome. I'm going to go in alphabetical order, Maya, so I'm going to come back to you. Next, we have Asmaret Assefa-Berhi. She was the Director of Science at the U.S. Department of Energy. She's on leave from UC Merced, where she holds the Ted and Jan Falasco Chair in Earth Sciences and Geology, is a professor of soil biogeochemistry, and previously served as Associate Dean for Graduate Education. She's a biogeochemist with a research focus on climate change impacts on nutrient budgets in soils. I assign her fantastic TED Talk, a climate solution that's right beneath our feet, in one of my classes. You should check it out. Her research focus lies at the intersection of soil science, global change science, and political ecology, with an emphasis on how the soil system regulates the Earth's climate and the dynamic two-way relationship between the natural environment and human communities. Dr. Berhi's scholarship and efforts to ensure equity and inclusion for people from all walks of life in the scientific enterprise have received numerous awards and honors. Welcome, Dr. Berhi. Maya Carrasquillo is an assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering and the PI of the Liberatory Infrastructures Lab at UC Berkeley. The mission of her lab is to develop systems of critical infrastructure that support liberation and restorative justice for all. She is also the faculty director of UC Berkeley's Community Engaged Education program. Her research focuses on sustainable and equitable urban water infrastructure, food, energy, water systems, community engagement, and community science in decision-making, and environmental and infrastructural justice. She is a certified Envision sustainability professional and a College of Engineering Holzkemp Fellow. Dr. Carrasquillo is a recipient of the prestigious Georgia Tech Alumni 40 Under 40 Award for the class of 2022. Welcome, Dr. Carrasquillo. And alphabetically last is Alexei Sagona. He's a fifth-year PhD candidate at UC Berkeley's Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management, where he studies indigenous environmental governance. Using ethnographic methods, his research investigates how the Amamutsin tribal band enacts their cultural obligation to steward ancestral landscapes, despite limitations as a non-federally recognized tribal community. He serves as chair of the Amamutsin Land Trust Lands Committee, is involved in the Amamutsin-led Project Jurassic campaign, and is an advisory board member for Green Foothills. Welcome, Alexei. Before I dive into the substance of the questions, I want to highlight that there should be some index cards on your table and some pens. And I invite you to write questions down throughout the conversation. And those questions at a couple times during the program will be picked up by some volunteers and delivered to Brooke. Brooke, where are you? Brooke Thompson, who's one of our incredible PhD students in the Environmental Studies program, and she'll be curating the questions. So you have to get through Brooke to get to me. So we'll have some time for questions at the end. Okay. So Enrico and I envisioned this event as one wherein we could ground the rather abstract concept of leadership and how we might reimagine it in the very concrete empirical case of climate change. We start from the premise that historically dominant models of scholarship and policy development have been largely ineffective in moving the needle on climate response. Indeed, we are reminded on a daily basis of the devastating impacts of climate change, with the brunt of those impacts being felt by low-income communities and communities of color across the globe. Each of you approach your scholarship and advocacy in a way that pushes us to do better. From Maya's integration of community engagement and equity analyses in urban infrastructural design for climate adaptation projects, Azmaret's work exposing the exclusionary practices in the ecology and geoscience research communities, Alexi's work bridging Western and indigenous science to revitalize Amah Mutsun culture and stewardship practices, and Kacha's hugely impressive work on the integration of Native American studies curriculum across disciplines and departments at our own university. You are all incredibly inspiring leaders who are creating a new mold for what leadership can and should look like. Thank you so much for being here. Over the course of the next hour, we'll learn more about your accomplishments. As panel moderator, I've divided my questions into 3 groups. The first is about your scholarship and some of the work you've done to help reimagine climate scholarship in ways that center justice. The second area I'd like to talk about is UCSC's newly minted strategic plan, released earlier this week by Chancellor Larive, and in particular, draw on your expertise to think through how we might best implement elements of our plan that focus on climate justice and indigenous science. And the third area I'd like to talk about is reimagining leadership more broadly with you all by discussing what informs your own leadership approach and how you think about catalyzing and effectuating positive change. Enrico and I invited you all here, not only because we deeply admire your scholarship, but equally importantly, because we admire the way you do that scholarship. From design to dissemination, your scholarship centers justice as an essential component for the production of effective climate response. You are all redefining leadership in the academy and beyond in the ways your scholarship pushes us to rethink how we engage with one another and with the earth, in demonstrating how we can center communities in our work and in disrupting power structures, as well as in elevating diverse voices to develop more equitable and effective climate response strategies. I'd like to start off by talking about how you do this. And I have one question for each of you in this area. Maya, if it's okay, I'll start with you. One of our campus's emerging strengths is in community-engaged work. Your own work is at the vanguard of community-engaged scholarship. Can you tell us a bit about how you engage communities in your climate adaptation work and how those approaches have contributed not only to more equitable outcomes, but also to better engineering outcomes?
Sure. Thank you all so much for having me. I think this is probably the most beautiful and love-filled academic environment that I've ever been in. So try to hold back tears earlier. So it's such a pleasure and such an honor to be here with each of you. And yes, just want to honor Enrico and Sakina for creating this space and inviting me to be a part of this panel. As you heard in my bio, I'm an engineer, which is really funny to say when I talk about the work of community engagement. So I'm an engineer. I've been doing community engagement work, though, for as long as I can remember. Before I was an engineer, I was a community engaged worker, whether that was community service as a child, just building relationships was always a part of what I've done. So before I identified as an engineer, I've always been in the space of community engagement. And the work we do in my research group, and as I've done historically, we strive to give more than we get. So oftentimes there's models of community engaged scholarship of reciprocity. And for us, it's more so motivated by radical generosity rather than reciprocity and acknowledgement of the past and ongoing harms that researchers and engineers have often inflicted on vulnerable communities. So when I decided to pursue my doctorate at the University of South Florida, I began working alongside residents in the community of East Tampa, which is a historically and predominantly African-American community in the city. I am trained by anthropologists, so my degrees are in environmental engineering, but I've been able to learn so much from social scientists and anthropologists who have trained me. And so much of my work actually centers ethnographic approaches to building community and thinking about learning and building rather than studying and observing. So past research has focused on stormwater management approaches, green infrastructure, and in particular, identifying what was a pain point for many residents in East Tampa. I did not get into my PhD to do the work of stormwater. I got into it to do work alongside communities, and stormwater is actually a particular pain point for the residents in East Tampa. They would describe so many of the stormwater ponds as eyesores, and then there was a lot of questions around why is it that East Tampa has more stormwater ponds than any other community in the city of Tampa. And so in my research, I sought to explore some of the answers to those questions and really begin to reimagine strategies for better maintenance and redesign of stormwater infrastructure. One of the outcomes that I'm proud of, although the city of Tampa doesn't actually cite the work, but go figure. Throughout the process of doing my PhD research, I interviewed several staff members with the City of Tampa, Department of Stormwater, Department of Transportation. And so out of that came more equitable strategies that the city is now trying to adopt around green stormwater infrastructure. Again, they don't cite the work, but at the very least, even as uncomfortable as they were in those conversations, it got them thinking about the right questions that they need to start asking as engineers and transportation planners doing this work. So transitioning a little bit into what I now do, as Sakina mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in civil and environmental engineering at UC Berkeley. And, you know, I've been wrestling a lot with what it means to be an engineer and doing this work, and really been focusing a lot more on shifting engineering's legacy and really correcting that legacy from being one of destruction and dehumanization and building systems. So much of the motivation for my current research group is unpacking infrastructural justice and legacies of infrastructural violence. And I think what is maybe even more of an appropriate term is infrastructure apartheid, and how we've built systems, and even so much of infrastructure is designed around grid systems, and yet you can still be within that grid system and still not have access to basic resources. And so much of the work that we do now within my research lab, the Liberatory Infrastructures Lab, is really focusing on those who are truly most vulnerable, those who are truly most excluded. We have projects that are focusing on working and thinking about food distribution and access for unhoused neighbors in the West Oakland region. One of my students is really interested in exploring the impact of energy grid disruptions for persons who are incarcerated. So again, thinking about the infrastructure systems that we create, but also how they impact those who are still humans but are still forgotten. And so, yeah, a lot of the work that I do is, again, just focusing on those who are truly most vulnerable, those who may not have access, and those who have been historically harmed by the infrastructure that engineers have created.
Thank you. Azmaret, you're next, if that's okay. Yes. So in addition to the amazing work you do in biogeochemistry, I also fell into the hole of reading your work about equity and how the sciences have some work to do, as do we all, in enhancing equity in the workplace. Your work has illuminated some critical barriers to equitable participation in the academy. You've written about a dozen papers about how exclusionary hostile workplaces in ecology and geosciences impact faculty retention, especially for faculty from underrepresented backgrounds. This has huge implications for who is doing the crucial work of climate science and climate justice, and in turn, our ability to construct just and effective response strategies. Can you tell us a bit more about what your research has found in this area, why it matters for climate science, and what steps institutional leaders must take to turn these pervasive trends around on their own campuses?
Indeed. Thank you. First of all, let me start by saying thank you to Sakina and Rico for the invitation. I've always enjoyed coming by your beautiful campus. I think that's something that I'm sure you all never get tired of hearing, but this place is incredible. Just beautiful. It feels like a park every time I drive through the road, seriously. But, you know, so as Sakina said, so my work is mostly in soil biogeochemistry. And my lab at UC Merced, so you've heard that I'm on leave, we're serving at the Department of Energy right now in the Biden administration, but I think for this part, I'll focus on the work that we've done at UC Merced in my lab and collaborations that led to the topics that you discussed. So the main work that we deal with is trying to understand how and why the soil system regulates the Earth's climate. So we all understand at this point that a lot of carbon is stored in soil, way more than in the atmosphere and vegetation combined. And so because of that, then any change in the amount of carbon that comes in and out of soil into that fluxus has huge implications. So we try to understand the mechanisms that are responsible for holding on to that carbon in soil once it gets into the soil for tens, hundreds of years, and even millennia, and sometimes longer. And so a lot of the nitty-gritty, like chemistry work, a lot of spectroscopy, and trying to understand microbially mediated processes and how they unfold in this really incredibly beautiful world of soil. But obviously, when you're thinking about soil and climate, you can't divorce that from people at some level, right? But in the other part of the work, partly because of who I am as a Black woman, born and raised in Africa, came to grad school in Michigan and later in the UC system, and has experienced like a lot of things that I don't think would be surprised to anybody at this point, right? Like most people from minoritized backgrounds experience them. One of the things that happened early on in my PhD is I really needed to understand why I found myself in this situation in the academic institutions. And I delved really deep into the scholarship on equity and inclusion in STEM, and learned a lot, obviously, from the social science work that has been happening in the space for a long time, and ended up eventually working to contribute to that, in particular things that are relevant for our earth and environmental science community. And there's a lot of things that we found over the years, but I'll give you a couple of interesting statistics, sad, but interesting statistics. So the geosciences happen to be one of the least diverse fields in STEM, even less diverse in many cases than physics and some fields of engineering. That says a lot. It takes a lot of work for a field to be that. No, I'm serious, right? I know it's a ridiculous kind of thing to think about, but we happen to have one of the least diverse fields. And yet our field is also tasked with trying to explain and understand some of the most fundamental crises, like the most serious issues of climate change that we're facing. So the reality of the situation is then that folks who do not represent most of society end up prioritizing decisions all the way from the science to adaptation, mitigation, and all sorts of issues that you can imagine. And I've always found this very disturbing. So anyway, some of the work that we've done with some of my long-term collaborators on the equity and inclusion work in the geosciences, we co-founded a group called Advanced Geo that some of you might know, that works to empower scientists. In particular, we started with geoscientists, but generally now that empowers scientists to really understand and work to address exclusionary behaviors in STEM. And we did that because, for decades, federal funding agencies, universities, and others have talked about addressing issues of lack of representation and diversity. But the reality of the situation is the needle has barely moved. We don't really have diversity, especially in some fields. Some fields have made some significant progress that they should be applauded for, but others, not so much, like my field. And a big part of this has to do with the workplaces, where people work, what kind of treatments folks from different backgrounds experience when they enter into the academic spaces. And to give you an idea, we did the largest survey of the earth science research community in partnership with the American Geophysical Union, the largest union of earth scientists anywhere in the world. They're our partners in the advanced geo work. And we find that roughly about 50% of all the women of color that we interviewed and people who identify as trans, bisexual, and members of the LGBTQ community, 50% tell us that because of their experiences in the scientific community, at school and graduate school, or trying to make a career when they're early in their careers, because of that experience, they've either left the science or are considering altogether leaving the science. And this is also true for a third of people from across multiple minoritized community groups in the geosciences. That should be disturbing to anybody, right? Half of the people from certain groups that come into our communities that we work to recruit don't want to stay. And of course, that has a lot to do with what we call the hostile obstacle course that people from minoritized communities are forced to go through in STEM. What do we mean by that? That means that everybody has to work through some really difficult challenges to ascend in our careers in STEM. But the reality of the situation is one segment of that community has to go through a series of obstacle courses, right, that they have to maneuver through before they can actually enter and make progress in their field and hopefully reach to leadership positions, those who manage to stay. But even those who manage to stay and those who manage to succeed only do so after experiencing a lot of serious hurt, damage, physiological and mental anguish that they have to experience just to be able to do the science and just to be able to contribute to solving these major global issues that affect the whole world, really, and especially issues that affect people of minoritized backgrounds, people of low socioeconomic class, people of color, people from island nations and tropical communities, all of these people that had very little to do with the climate crisis, but are now bearing the brunt of the damage, right? That have no voice in the scientific community. And the people that represent that voice can't thrive in the scientific community. And so, anyway, I'll probably stop here, but talk about that for a moment. Thank you.
Well, Ashwin, I'll push you a little bit on one last question related to this, which is, what do we do about it? What's your recommendations or your advice for leaders to turn those trends around?
Indeed. So one of the things we did when we were publishing the work on hostile obstacle courses was an effort to reframe this conversation away from just numbers and leaky pipelines that we like to talk about in the academy to the obstacle course metaphor, because to me that's extremely important, as now we're talking about identifying barriers. And it is then a responsibility of leaders to remove those barriers so that people from all walks of life can thrive. So to me, fundamentally, leaders have a responsibility to really think about where those barriers are that are preventing anybody really from being able to enter and advance through the career and remove them. That's probably, obviously it's not easy, right? But if we're not willing to do that, it means we're only investing in the success of one segment of the community and not others. And obviously that's not okay.
Thank you. Maybe over dinner we can talk more about what some of those barriers are.
Oh, yeah.
Alexi, one of the things you highlight in your scholarship is the ways in which current environmental policies are rooted in colonialism, and in turn, how this limits land stewardship possibilities. Since we're a very interdisciplinary audience today, I'm hoping you'd be willing to break that down a little bit for us. What does it mean for environmental policy to be rooted in colonialism, and how does that limit land stewardship possibilities? And if you could also talk about the implications that all of that has for the development of just and effective climate responses.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone for being here. It's an honor to be up here alongside these wonderful panelists. And apologize to this side of the room for just seeing the back of my head when you're trying to see all these wonderful panelists. Maybe I'll duck a little bit next time they're speaking for you. But, you know, to get at the root of what colonialism has impacted our way of managing the environment, I think it's sort of a great analogy is, you know, there's a resource mindset or a relational mindset. Seeing land and non-human relatives as sort of a resource to be managed, to be used, to be controlled, versus seeing these things as kin. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, I think we're in a wonderful time right now where there's great energy pushing towards indigenous stewardship, pushing towards understanding that, you know, we depend on our non-human relatives just like they depend on us. but there still are things like environmental regulations that inhibit that. So specifically, for the Amamutsun tribal band, the work to do stewardship involves working on lands held by other entities, such as state parks, such as Bureau of Land Management, and so on. And so the question, first of all, of like, this is tribal sovereignty, this is tribal land, this is our jurisdiction, that really isn't on the table. And so for the Amamutsun community, it's navigating the local coastal regulations. And I'll give a little bit of an example of how these local coastal commissions and things work and how they're sort of inhibiting tribal stewardship practices. So, I'm talking specifically about 20 miles north of here on the coast in San Mateo County. The regulations there come from the Coastal Act in the 1970s, which created local coastal programs, which basically means at the local level, counties can decide, how to manage coastal resources, so to say. And this was, in San Mateo County, it was created in the 80s. And so in the 80s, they decided, first of all, that any sort of natural resource management, any vegetation removal, should be lumped in as something that is development, that requires a burdensome process to get a permit. And what that means is, for someone just practically trying to get out on the land and do vegetation management, let's say stewardship, right? Call it that. You have to jump through a lot of hoops. So for tribal members, this is about the sacred obligation to Creator to maintain, our cultural foodways, the grasslands, for example. And for many of you all here, you may know grasslands rely on disturbance and active management. And so in this instance, you're looking at a tribe trying to maintain access to foodways, to medicine plants, but then has to jump through all these loopholes and basically say, oh, this isn't actually development, this is just maintaining what we've done for thousands of years. And on top of that, the area is planned as an agricultural district. So there's different zoning in the coastal program. So some land is zoned as agricultural, some land is zoned as parklands. And I think that really speaks to how, in the past, our Western society thinks about the uses of place. So for indigenous peoples, these protected natural areas aren't just places of recreation. Nor is indigenous stewardship necessarily agriculture. Here in California on the coast, broadcast burning and cultivating things where they belong, where they are, doesn't necessarily constitute agriculture, right? And so this has involved the tribe also to argue, and this is Chairman Lopez's leadership, of saying, well, I guess we fit into agriculture if you wanted to check one of the boxes. We'll figure it out. But really what this is doing is it's applying a certain mindset of how land should be used, how we think about what development is, and sort of forcing that. And I think these things should be changed so that, different perspectives, seeing things as, coming to a place, thinking about caring for it, and not thinking about, that if somebody touches something, it's gonna, have deleterious effects, right? And I should note, contextually, we're in a place where folks have really tried to advocate for the protection of natural lands in this area because of the widespread, development over the last several decades. So of course, it's wonderful that there's so much land that has been protected in this region, but I think it's still, embodying that preservationist mindset that's thinking about these things as resources that is inhibiting stewardship and reciprocal relations.
Thank you. Katja, your turn. One of the aspects I found really fascinating about your work as I was preparing for this panel was some of the work that you've done on indigenous models of resistance and resilience. I was hoping you could discuss some of those models and how they inform approaches to climate policy that centers environmental justice.
Sure, and thank you, everyone. I really love that you want to come out on like a Thursday night and listen to a panel of academics talk. I think that's amazing. I always invite my kids to come with me places, and they're like, no, thank you. So thank you for being here to listen to us speak. I think when I think about the work that we do in climate resiliency and climate justice as Indigenous peoples, it's a lived experience that we've all had our entire lives that now is coming to the forefront because what we're seeing is not some kind of abstract impact of ongoing settler colonialism. We're seeing what happens when we continue to live in an unbalanced way with the earth. And it's something that I joke about with my students and people I speak to, where I'm always like, Western science, I've been taught my whole life that Western science is like the toddlers of this place. They think that they know everything. And my great uncle would always be like, they're like toddlers, where you're like, this plant does this, and they go, I know, right? Or they're always telling you like what they've discovered. And as an indigenous person whose knowledge spans thousands upon thousands of years, which is a lot of scientific experimentation of how you live in a place, how you understand it. We start and stop and think and observe. We've been doing that for so long that sometimes what happens is new discoveries will come out, and I will go to my computer and I save them in a file on my computer called Stuff Indigenous Peoples Have Been Trying to Tell You Since You Got Here. And it'll be like, did you know trees talk to each other? Right? Yeah. Why do you think we talk to the trees when we go out there? And I try to help people to understand that the longevity of our connection to this place means that what we can add is an understanding of what the world looks like, functions like, feels like when you don't have colonialism and capitalism and imperialism affecting your decision making about how you do things. And if we know the world before that, which we can tell you stories about it, we can tell you like how the world functions together. It also means that indigenous peoples represent and can functionally explain to you what the world could look like post capitalism, imperialism, settler colonialism, all those things. And part of the issue that I see when I go in to talk to a lot of Western scientific audiences is I say, like, well, part of the problem with why indigenous peoples are constantly pushing back against conservation efforts, restoration efforts that really center Western theory and thought is because a lot of Western science wants to do environmentalism but with capitalism. And you can't. You can't be an environmentalist and be a capitalist. I'm sorry. It's just how it works. And we as indigenous peoples can tell you about this world and what this looks like. We also then know when things change. And I will tell you as an indigenous science practitioner, people I have worked with for a very long time are the first on the ground that will tell you that things are changing with plants, with animals, with our more than human relatives, with the water, that things are changing very fast. And that we're noticing those because we interact with them on a fairly regular basis in a very an ongoing relationship that we have cultivated for thousands of years. So we can tell you when they're struggling, when they need help, when things are, when seasons are changing, when gathering times are changing. And my favorite thing to do is to just be in spaces and then just be the person who raises their hand and says, but have you asked the indigenous peoples about this thing that you're about to do? Have you talked to Native peoples about this thing you're thinking about? And I think what we've been able to do is bring Native peoples into Western scientific spaces that open up the possibility of what science is and could be and should look like. We always explain to our students, because most of our students now, our first-year students in the sciences, will take a Native American Studies class in their first year at Cal Poly Humboldt. And we always tell them, you probably know more about sort of the questioning of how we do this science than anybody that you're actually going to be learning from. Your science is going to be better. You're going to ask better questions. You're going to start from a place of a really great question that you wouldn't have thought of before, because your question is going to think, what does this mean for what we're doing right now in the context not just of a scientific experiment created in a vacuum, but instead a community, a space, a people, a place, and a future. And I really think that I get very excited about having those conversations. I will also say that I tell this to people, I was a science major when I was an undergraduate. I was somebody who felt very pushed out of the sciences as an undergraduate, Native student, because I was asking questions that people were like, you can't ask those kinds of questions as a scientist. and suddenly going, well, where do I go if I want to do this type of work, but I can't ask that kind of question? And it wasn't until I got much older that I figured there was a reason why so many of our peoples had fought from like the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, so that in the 1970s we could have Native American and Indigenous studies in the academy, because we needed that place to be able to ask those kinds of questions. And I will tell you, coming from a discipline that wasn't invited into a Western academic institution, you are always coming into a space with a little bit of pushback as to why you're even there, what the conversation is for, if you truly belong. And I will tell people a lot that the work that we do as Indigenous peoples to constantly invite other disciplines into the conversation is really trying to stave off and push back against epistemic violence, this idea that somehow our knowledge is not just as important as Western knowledge. And there's so much there. We have so much knowledge about everything here in these spaces. So I really look forward to the way that people think about doing that in the future. I will tell you that as an Indigenous person, when I talk about the work I do in community, but I also talk about the work that I do with like our more than human relatives, which a lot of people refer to as like natural resources. I never fancied myself like a scientist in that. But I think we have to redefine and constantly let our young people know that like curiosity, asking good questions, building relationships, and wanting to make a difference in the world can also be science. And that's kind of what we're trying to do as we talk and push those things forward.
Wow, thank you all. I think you spurred many, many questions. Those index cards, hopefully you're passing around. I have many and won't have time to ask them now, but hopefully it can spark some conversation over dinner. I'm going to switch gears and zoom into our campus specifically and seek some of your advice. As I mentioned, we just launched our strategic plan a couple of days ago. It's entitled Leading the Change. And one of the very unusual aspects of that plan is that UCSC is one of the first universities in the country to include climate resilience among the 5 pillars, alongside graduate and undergraduate education, research excellence, and ensuring an inclusive campus community. Moreover, the Chancellor and CPEVC are committed to taking an equity-centered approach in the way our campus will address climate change. Some of the specific goals articulated in the plan related to climate justice include ensuring all students graduate with an interdisciplinary understanding of climate change grounded in climate justice, expanding climate justice research, including through the hiring of 10 new faculty in the area over the next 5 years, and centering and elevating Indigenous science on our campus through, for example, hiring new faculty in this area, creating a department and/or Center of Indigenous Studies, and increasing curricular content in this area campus-wide. That last goal in particular has me looking at you, Katja, because you've done incredible work on your campus in that regard. Under your leadership, the Native American Studies Department at Humboldt, you've seen institutional changes to elevate Indigenous science and Native American studies across campus. Under your leadership, 80% of all science majors now take a class in Native American studies. In addition, you led a partnership for your department in developing the new Master of Science program in Engineering and Community Practice, which focuses on equipping those interested in resource management positions with the skills to interface and work with Indigenous and traditionally underserved communities. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your work in this area. What were the most exciting successes? What were some of the most significant challenges and how did you overcome them? And what advice do you have for UCSC in how to most effectively pursue some of the ambitious goals outlined in our new plan in this area?
So part of what we're doing at Cal Poly Humboldt right now that's really exciting is a focus on place-based learning. And what was able to happen because of the work in Native American Studies, but also with our partners in various of the science disciplines, is this conversation about, as we're developing place-based learning for each of the majors, what are the goals and values that we have to bring into it. And one of the very clearly stated goals and values is that Indigenous peoples and Native studies has to be a part of that curriculum. If you're doing place-based learning without Native studies and Native people, then you're not learning about the place. Not really. And I think that that's what grew this interest in making sure that our first-year students in STEM were taking Native American studies classes. But then what they also saw was the importance for those students, and these are not just Native students, these are like all students that are coming into the university, to see a connection between their major and science and what could be for community and change and the future and what they wanted to do. And so instead of feeling like they were learning kind of in a vacuum without this idea of like, well, how am I going to apply this? How am I going to make this into something that helps me to change the world? Because they come in wanting to change the world, and then they have to like spend all this time learning like botany and names of plants in Latin. And then they come into our classrooms as Native people, and then we're like, let's talk about like what happens when you start to see the world through the relationships that plants have to each other, the way that like these things work together, the names of things. I always ask them, like, why do you have to learn like the Latin names for a plant? And they always go, I don't know. And then I say, I think it's because it makes you sound smarter. But like also we have to see the relationship in how they're named. And we can do that in Indigenous languages, and we can do that through like a Latin terminology. So I like to see them kind of open up their ideas about what they're doing as a scientist because of it. We've been able to do a couple of really cool things. We have the Masters of Community Practice in Engineering. That's a brand new program that just started this year. They take half their courses in engineering and half their courses in Native American Studies, learning how to work with Native communities to build long-term climate justice, climate energy projects. Then we also now have got approved by the Board of Trustees to launch the first Bachelor of Science in Indigenous Science. So we'll be putting that together to launch in 2025. And then we also we're getting ready. They keep telling me it's going to be October. First it was October 20th. Now it's October 27th. So I'll let you know when it actually happens. But by the end of October, we will be opening our Food Sovereignty Lab and Traditional Ecological Knowledges Institute. And this has been a 3-year project, which actually happened because I went into a class that I was teaching. And this is the beautiful thing about, I think, what we can do with our students when we start opening up for them where science can go, like what it can be applied towards. I went into one of my classes, which is called Indigenous Natural Resource Management Practices. And it's primarily science majors and Native American Studies majors. And I was like, normally I'd have you guys do a group project, but let's like do something that we can like leave behind in the community when we're done. And we spent the whole semester trying to come up with a project, and they interviewed elders and community members, students and staff, all Native. Then they held a public stakeholders meeting. They went to tribes and they were like, what should we do on this campus to sort of help with Indigenous peoples? And they said, we want a food sovereignty lab. That's what we want to have happen. And so they then spent the whole semester writing a plan for what the food sovereignty lab could be, how it could work. And then they came to me after the end of that. They wrote a report, right? We published it. And then at the end of it, they said, oh, there's a space open. Like there's a space that used to be a store that sold primarily donuts and soda and Red Bull. And it closed, but they need something to go into it. So we should do that. So then we worked on the application as a class, and we filled out the application for space. We turned it in. Difficulties with the university. It was interesting because that all happened, and then our space request was denied by the space committee. And they said that they wanted it to be a space that would be for all students. And that what they saw was it was too specialized, and they thought it was like just going to be for like Native American students. And they just said no, and they didn't give us any sort of like announcement of that. And so they came to class, they were very sad. I will tell you the thing about working with the students, they get so invested. And so they were just really sad. And I remember one student said, like, why doesn't our university care for us? And like the things that we want to do. And they kept saying, what do we do now? And I said, well, now we navigate a bureaucracy. So So then the whole class became about like, how do you navigate a bureaucracy? And I was like, okay. And so I told them, somebody has to read all the space policies, right? And to their credit, they read every single space policy that had been written for the last like 22 years on our campus until they found a singular line that said all decisions of the Space Committee can be appealed to the Academic Senate. And they came to class, they're like, what does this mean? And I was like, we're going to the Academic Senate. So then we all showed up at the Senate. The students each had 3 minutes because they signed up for the public comment. They actually worked it out so like they were doing it one by one and adding on to what the other one said. They practiced. We had like practice time. We showed up to the Senate. Each of them did their testimony. And then by the end of it, the Senate was like, wait, you can appeal to the Academic Senate? And they're like, we don't know what that is. Like, we've never had anybody do that. And I was like, well, we're here, we're appealing, like, vote. And in the end, the Space Committee who was there said, oh, never mind, like, we'll change our mind, we'll vote to give you the space. But what they made clear was that it was conditional upon our raising all of the funds and that the university would never fund the Food Sovereignty Lab or the Institute. And so then we had to go into a 2-year, they gave us 2 years to raise all the money. They priced it out at $250,000. We raised $250,000 in 3 months with these students. After that, they started construction, and I don't know if you guys have done construction lately. For the last year, we've been constructing. It's now up to $485,000. And so we're back in fundraising mode. The students are doing all the work that they can to like get fundraising out there. But I will tell you, it's going to open. It's going to open in like 3 weeks. It's going to open. And so what I teach people about this work is I'm constantly like, just start talking about what you want to see in the world. Yeah. And then just decide that that's what you're going to start to make happen. And I always say in an indigenous context, nothing can become until you story it into being. Nothing can be until you tell a story about it. So when we are in these spaces together, we should dream big, because big isn't so big when you just start talking about it like what could be. And then you watch as those things start to line up for you, because the things that we want to do to put the world back into balance they make sense. And the world itself is going to support you in doing that work.
That's good.
Wow. I'll ask one more question. It's related to the strategic plan. Alexine, I'll direct this one at you, because some of your dissertation work is related to some of the goals we outlined in our plan. So I'll focus on the goal to engage and create cultural conservation easements that provide access to traditional lands for Amamutsun tribal land stewardship, which is outlined in our plan. So as a scholarly expert on this topic, how do you conceptualize land back and how it could be meaningful?
Thank you. That's a great question. I first want to highlight, I think, some core tenets that I've learned about indigenous environmental justice. I think oftentimes folks talk about environmental justice as, wanting a seat at the table, so to say. And I've seen and am inspired by a lot of indigenous scholars saying, we want a whole new table, right? And so when I think about land back, I'm reminded of Chairman Lopez talking about, Creator gave us the responsibility to take care of Mother Earth, not to own it, right? Thinking about other scholars who are talking about, this isn't about ownership. This isn't about trying to get rights. This is about responsibilities first. And if it has to do with rights, then, so be it. But this is centering responsibility. There's some really great scholarship as well that even poses the question of what if land is recategorized into something that can't be owned, And I think that's where it's really interesting to start the conversations and talking about, doing a shared access agreement or a cultural conservation easement, rather than getting into the nitty-gritty of, okay, a cultural conservation easement is a type of property, let's try to write out the bylaws and, let's figure it out from here. I think starting with a broad conversation first is really important. And I will say with a related access agreements that the Amamutsun tribal band have negotiated has been through MOUs, Memorandum of Understanding. And these access agreements, what I've found is that it's about the relationship And the process of getting the MOU done, more than it's about what's actually written down on the paper, right? And so oftentimes in negotiating these agreements and writing these things down, you can actually, develop trust, which is really important. And you can, make sure that there's a relationship that might go above and beyond what the paper actually says. But one thing I think is really interesting, specifically to cultural conservation easements, is the rights of nature movement that a lot of tribes are doing. The Wanganui in New Zealand, the river, the rights of the Klamath that the Yurok tribe have talked about, right? The rights of Mother Earth, the inherent rights of it. What the Amamutsun are doing right now are trying to consider, if we're let's think about, our more than human relatives as, having agency, as having power, and thinking about what constitutes harm if we're seeing, a creek or a river as a person, right? And I think putting that into cultural conservation easements as a way to represent and protect Mother Earth is a really innovative concept that the tribe is working through right now.
Thank you. I'll transition to the last set of questions. And these are about leadership. And I'll ask you to reflect on your own approach. So the social change ecosystem map troubles the idea of a singular leader. It instead sees change through connection rooted in shared values of equity, justice, solidarity, and liberation. It points to various different qualities of leadership that different people bring to a shared goal, such as climate justice. You can see some of the leadership qualities that our center has identified as important reflected in the names we've given each of the tables. We identified empathy, community, uplifting others, love, self-awareness, integrity, cultural humility, courage, authenticity, willingness to disrupt, and vulnerability. As nobody can ever be all of these things, much less all of them at the same time, this framing pushes us to reimagine leadership from a place of collectivity. In thinking about your own leadership style, what qualities do you bring, and which aspects of leadership allow you to rely on and be inspired by others? And I'll ask Maya and Asmaret to perhaps lead us on this one.
Yeah, I feel like leadership is such a, it's such a weird word because I feel like it inherently implies some level of hierarchy, right? And so, even just kind of unpacking what leadership means, I think for me, starting from the core, it's shared and collective responsibility. I think, the core, I'll say it this way, I like to start with core principles. So for me, these include love, integrity, vulnerability, and faith. That's the foundation for me that I build teams on, that I build, collaborations upon. And I realized, especially as in the early stages of my career as a PI, that if those don't undergird the work and the relationships, it's one thing for those to be core values of the work, but if it doesn't undergird people's identities and how we seek to build relationships, and it's really difficult to build anything else that'll last. So from there, then, I can bring in core strengths that I like to operate in. I highlight maybe the difference between strengths that I can operate in and like to operate in, because I realize that teams are better when all of us can operate from a place of joy in the things that we bring to the table. And so for me, that's where, strategic thinking comes in. I am an engineer, I'm an engineer. I am trained by social scientists, but I'm still an engineer in my core. So strategy, strategic thinking, and then also just being able to ideate and vision, I think, is one of the skills that I've learned to really hone and to appreciate. I think it's a skill that is not inherently considered to be core to engineers as we function, but I realize that that is what has allowed my career, my teams to be able to thrive, because it's being able to share in this vision that allows us to dream big and really, envision a world where everyone is free. Really, that is the core of what our research group is based on. And so being able to share in that vision and then from there share responsibility has been, just kind of the spaces that I've operated in, and again, find the most joy in the work that I do.
That was just beautifully said. So to me, when I think about leadership, first and foremost, it's the privilege that comes with being able to actually, convene, lead, and provide maybe guidance or have decision-making authority, right? But a lot of that boils down to responsibility. And the responsibility to actually make sure that, at least to myself, uphold the values that I hold important. And if I were to pick a few, it would have to be, first and foremost, justice. Make sure that everybody gets a chance to actually be heard, right? And that with justice comes respect then. Respecting people's perspectives, needs. We all have come with very different views, experiences, abilities, but we all might have very different things to contribute to the system. And the other one is humility, and to really not fool myself into thinking that I have all the answers, right? I will never have all the answers. And so if I only respect people and treat everybody fairly in a just way, that we can all actually be better off in the environment that I am responsible for guiding. And there are a lot of things we could say about that, right? To me, in some ways, in an academic setting in particular, Enrico said it beautifully earlier, so much of what happens in academic settings, and especially some of the things we're trying to address in STEM with inequity and exclusionary behaviors, really expose sometimes the lack of humility in our approaches, especially when, faculty from the positions of power and privilege that we hold in the academic systems, how that lack of humility translates into us having, undue amount of power, influence in the system that denies so many of the others that could have contributed the opportunity, really, a seat at the table, or even the opportunity for them to create that appropriate table that they need to, right? And yeah, maybe that's it. Thank you.
I had one more question for you, but in the interest of time, I'll pose it and invite you all to talk about it over dinner instead of right now, so we can take some questions from the audience. But the last question I'll pose for food for thought, literally and figuratively. It's easy to get in a place of despair when thinking about climate justice. What does leading with hope mean to you? And when it is not available, what do you reach for in those moments? Okay, so the question that rose to the top for Brooke, she's giving me a second one too. I think we'll have time for two, and then we'll transition to dinner. But her favorite question what are you feeling a sense of urgency about as it relates to climate justice? And I'll invite whoever feels moved to answer that to step in and do so.
I guess what I'll say is I urgently want to see all the land given back to Indigenous peoples. And I do a lot of talks about land back, and I will tell you, if you've never heard a really concise lecture about land back or land return, saying it out loud in spaces will often elicit a lot of wait, what? From most people. I will oftentimes get people coming up to me afterwards, and they'll be like, so you want us to give all the land back? And I'll be like, yeah, all of it. And I once had this guy who was like, so you want my house? And I was like, I'll take your house. Sure. But I think what we're starting to see is there's been a lot of we can fix climate change with the systems that were invented by colonialism. And we can't, because climate change is a problem of colonialism. And so to redress a structural system that has been built, you have to also be willing to do the part where you dismantle the structure. And you disempower the structure and instead empower the people who have been left out of building that structure in the first place. And that might feel scary, but I have been there at land returns in my area that have happened, lands that have been returned to tribes with no qualifications to them, not like you have to use them as a conservation easement or you can't build anything. Just, here you go, we stole all this land from you, we should give it back. And the room, when you're in that space, when they return it, that is what it feels like to live with joy and to be happy about the places that you're going to build together. Because sometimes we come into spaces and we're like, why the despair? I think the despair comes from the loss and the violence that it took to build this place that we walk in every day. And that violence has never been redressed. It has never been approached. It has never been something that people truly are able to comprehend or understand. And then we go into these land spaces and we want to know why the land is so unhealthy and why the land feels the way that we feel. And it's because it also holds as part of it the scars of colonialism. It's written there on the landscape. It's waiting for us to say, we're here and we're here to care and build a relationship with you again. And the example of land return in our area, a sacred island that was returned, what the tribe did with it was they restored it. The people who had owned the land, the island, had built a seawall made of old batteries that came from like boats and cars and stuff. And they had to remove the seawall because it was leaching into the bay. And so you see them being like, you can't just possibly have this land back. I mean, what are you going to do with it? And we're like, what did you do with it? You built like a battery seawall, and now you're like, I don't know if we should give it back to tribes. Like, I mean, so they restored it. They watched as birds returned that they hadn't seen in over 100 years. They watched as different marine life started coming back, and we're like, oh, look, you've restored this place. They watched as the water itself got healthier. I think it made people feel really good. So those things are really possible. And when we think about a world post, sometimes people say we're headed for like an apocalyptic moment, right? What Indigenous peoples can tell you is there is a time beyond the apocalypse. And we will be rebuilding from this. It's not like an end is never just the complete end, and we have to know how to move through that together. And Indigenous peoples have already lived through an apocalypse. We know a world that's completely changed and a 90% reduction of our population, the loss of land, life, culture, and memory and history and all these things. We've already lived it. So what we can tell you is that to come out the other side, it takes time, community, love, joy, and a belief that it's possible. And so we have to just constantly remind ourselves that it's possible. I'm always telling people, nothing can be impossible. Nobody can tell me anything's impossible anymore. When I say, give all the land back, and you're like, that's impossible. And I'm like, nope, it's possible. Because if you traveled back in time and you got to go visit and like hang out with Thomas Jefferson, which you should never do, because that guy was not very cool. He's not a nice dude. But if you go hang out with him and you're like, don't worry, Thomas Jefferson, in 2021, we're gonna put an Indigenous woman in charge of the Department of the Interior. And she'll be running the Bureau of Land Management and the BIA, and that's where we'll be at. And he would look at you and he would say, that's impossible. So I always say, impossible things are happening in our lifetime. What's the impossible thing we're gonna create next?
Ashwin, do you feel moved to offer some thoughts on that?
I felt like that was a wonderful Don't you?
Then I'll move to Brooke's second question, and I think we'll end on this one. We know that interdisciplinary and intersectional approaches are key to addressing wicked problems such as climate change. Yet here at UCSC and throughout academia, STEM is elevated over social and other critical disciplines. More money, more visibility, more reverence. What can and should UCSC do to remedy this imbalance? I'm looking at you, Maya, but I don't know.
Ooh, that's a question. I don't know, the word that keeps coming to my mind is reconciliation. I think there, especially throughout the UC system, y'all know I'm at Berkeley, so there's a lot that could be said about a lot of the distorted history that's taken place there. But I think this holds true across the UC system. I think before we can do anything moving forward, we have to first reconcile and be willing to acknowledge and repair the harm that's been done with these university systems, period. I think if we don't do that, there's no hope for us to actually have any change, any real change, any freedom, any joy, any of the things that we all desire to go towards. That can't happen unless we first say we were wrong and this is how we want to repair that. So that's step one, right? Across the UC system, that needs to happen. And then I think after that, we can have more fruitful conversations and actions about where we want to go and and get to the future that we hope to envision.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Asmrat or Alexei?
Yeah, so as somebody who now runs an office that only almost exclusively funds basic science, this is a bit of a weird question for me to answer, but
No one's recording.
Physical sciences, obviously. But one thing that has changed, and I think it's a hopeful sign in that in recent times, is I think a deeper appreciation of the value of social science and humanities education for everybody, right? Not just for those in the field, but there's no lack of evidence at this point, right, of how the insular education that we had provided in science and engineering and how at times it could do a lot of harm. And I think our students would be better served by an approach that actually gives them not just the depth of understanding in the fields that they're trying to build their expertise or careers on, but rather kind of breadth also on really expands their worldview and allows them to think beyond those narrow disciplinary walls that we in the academy generally like to constrain ourselves with. So with that in mind, a lot of things are happening, at least at the funding agencies level, to make sure that there are not just what I call recovering scientists trying to do social science, but also bring in that expertise of social science and humanities scholars and others into the work that we're trying to fund, so to ensure that it's equitable and inclusive, and it's thinking really critically about then what, right? When we support the science or technology development, what happens after that? How can we make sure that it's, I think climate's a very good example of this, right? In many ways. There was phenomenal physical science work done in the climate space for a long time, and we knew it was going to be a problem. We were heading into danger for a long time, but we had no clue about what was the right way to communicate it and how to be inclusive of the people and to get people to actually care. I like to point out to people that physical scientists in our appreciation of the implication of the melting and disappearing sea ice and use the lonely polar bear that floating on the sea ice as the image for climate change for a long time. I think in many ways, if we'd actually consulted people who understood how you communicate stuff and urgency and the issues that we were affecting, and also included really the impact on people, real people that were going to experience the damage, the problem that we're having with climate denial and all that, complications maybe would not have been as bad as they turned out to be. So I think we're learning from those experiences at least.
Yeah, thank you. We're out of time. I would like to acknowledge all the thought that went into this stack of questions, and I'll be sure to type them up and share them with the panelists, so even though we don't have a chance to hear them all, they will hear them all. Well, first let's thank the panelists. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm so excited to know you all now. Before we break for dinner, I just want to give you a sense of what the rest of the evening looks like. So you'll note, if there's any cards left on your table, we would love it if you would write a word or a phrase or a sentence or a paragraph that resonates with you about reimagining leadership. So what are the qualities of leadership that resonate most strongly with you? And if you feel moved to do that, there's a box on the bar, so you can kind of kill two birds with one stone and put your card in the box and get yourself a drink during the break. We would love to hear them. For the rest of the evening, we'll start dinner fairly soon. We'll be eating family style, so food will be delivered to the table, and we'll invite you to pass it around and get to know one another. The bar's open for drinks, and you will each have a faculty moderator at your table who has generously agreed to gently moderate the conversation over dinner in relation to some of what we've talked about through this panel. So if I could just ask that each of the faculty moderators to please raise your hand, just identify yourself for your table so folks know who to look to. Okay, Lila. Okay, is anyone missing a faculty moderator? Let me know in the break if you are. And then second, just to thank the faculty moderators. Really appreciate you being willing to lend your expertise and your time